Yes. So today we're talking about the origins of the Cold War, which is a big and important topic. And I'm going to tell you things that are slightly different than the standard story in the textbooks. So the standard story in the textbooks basically is that the Soviets are to blame, that the Soviet regime, that the Stalinist regime imposed communist regimes in the liberated countries of Eastern Europe. And as a result of this, the West had to respond in defending democracy, prosperity, and the future of Europe. And therefore, they had to put a stop to this in the form of an Iron Curtain, basically stopping, containing Soviet expansion. That's the standard story you read all the time in the in the official textbooks. And as a proof of this benign and welcoming policy of the West, the American policy is presented as promoting democracy, prosperity, and usually what is cited is the Marshall Plan, which is billions of aid that poured to Europe. So America is such a good guy, benefactor, promoting democracy, prosperity. The Soviets are bad guys that promoting dictatorship and communist oppression. So that's the standard story. Okay, it's not exactly true. There are elements in it that are true, but basically it's far from true, and this is what we need to. Now let's move on to the second part of our discussion, and that is the US policy, the American policy in Germany, and how does it match against the Soviet policy in Eastern Europe and in Germany. Now, the starting point of this discussion is that the German policy, the United States German policy, was very similar at the time of President Roosevelt. So it was denazification, demilitarization, and one could even say even tougher policy pursued by Secretary Morgenthau, who actually spoke about dismemberment and deindustrialization. So there were voices in Washington under Roosevelt that were even tougher in punishing Germany than Stalin. Stalin did not support deindustrialization and certainly not dismemberment of creating 3 or 4 German states. So the point is, Stalin was not, was not as radically, hurting Germany, punishing Germany as some American proposals, official proposals were. So the starting point, denazification, democratization and demilitarization. And it is true that for a while the Americans pursued these policies. And the great result of denazification policy that worked between the Allies was the trial at Nuremberg, the famous Nuremberg trial, where they were Nazi leaders of the Nazi Reich were brought to trial, and there were 6 of them given death sentence. But of course, that was it. It didn't go any further, and very quickly in the American zone, denazification fizzled out. Now, if you compare denazification in the Soviet zone and denazification in the American zone, no questions by any objective criteria. There was no denazification in the American zone, none. Nazi criminals basically were left alone. They were allowed to live, and nobody was tried, neither by the Americans nor by the government of Konrad Adenauer when Germany became a sovereign state in 1949. In Western Germany, no Nazis were ever prosecuted. They were allowed to let live, and nothing happened. So denazification after Nuremberg trial 46 was dropped. A lot of these people were very powerful, influential. They were not, they were not SS Gestapo types, yet those hid, ran away to Latin America, to Argentina. Those people who ran SS camps, obviously they were not welcome. They could survive if they lie low or if they disappear. But if you're talking about Deutsche Bank, if you're about Krupp, Siemens, if you talk about all the people who supplied the weapons to the Wehrmacht and the poison gas to Auschwitz, all these people got away with nothing. They didn't pay any consequence whatsoever for their participation in the German military machine or in German extermination of people during World War II. So on the denazification, nothing was done. Now, on the deindustrialization, actually Americans did a whole lot more. The point is that the Russians were crude and awkward. You know, they would dismantle a factory and take it back, take it to Russia. It's really very visible and very damaging to the German psyche, but it does not actually create a long-lasting damage compared to what the Americans did. Americans were much smarter. They actually kidnapped German scientists and brought them from Travemünde. The Germans were pioneers of missiles. And the German missiles were actually, at that time, better than the Russian ones. The Russian Katyusha missiles were great on a short distance. In a frontline situation, they would fire 10, 20 kilometers. The Germans, by the end of 44, developed missiles that could hit London. They were like drones. They were without pilots. You sent a missile, you don't need to waste a pilot's life with carrying bombs. They could hit London flying by themselves, which was a technological breakthrough, and the Germans were pioneers in this. So the Americans just kidnapped those scientists and forced them to work for the United States. The same happened with the nuclear scientists. They were basically brought to the US, given green cards, and say, if you want to live, you're going to become Americans. And that was, robbery. Basically, this is robbery of national resources and brain power of German technology, much, much more sophisticated than dismantling a factory and bringing it to the Soviet Union as Stalin had done. And finally, the German deindustrialization by the Americans was a very smart policy of basically taking over German industry. To the present day, there are remnants of this. There's a German car brand which is called Opel, and it still produces pretty good cars. Now, for your information, the owner of Opel is General Motors. And on the books, the profits from Opel go to the American GDP because that's an American enterprise. There's nothing American about it. These are German cars made by Germans in Germany, but the owner is General Motors to the present day. Now, what also has to go to this rubric of deindustrialization, something that people don't quite aware of. The Germans had pretty much the best tanks and the best aircraft. Now, where is the German aircraft? There are none. It was dismantled and the engineers stolen. It's going to be now only American military aircraft. There is no German military aircraft, even though they could probably make a good one. And there are, of course, no German tanks. They do still produce the Leopard tank, which is pretty good. But it's pretty much in NATO, everything is American made. So in a sense, you could put it quite bluntly. The Americans did do in deindustrialization of Germany, except that it was in the form of taking over German technology, subordinating German industry to American interests, dismantling the German industry where the Germans were ahead, such as in missile technology, aviation technology, and engine technology. They basically robbed Germany of their leadership in the world technology, and that's where the Germany had been a leader before World War II, and probably would have been now if they hadn't been stopped by the Americans. So if you compare what the Stalin did and what the Americans did, I think the damage to Germany was much more done by the Americans than simply dismantling a few factories that could easily be replaced and new ones built on their place, as was the case in East Germany. Now about political affairs. In the American sector, The situation was much better than in the British or the French one. So that is true. Politically, Americans did promote democracy the way they understood it, which means a multi-party system, and which also meant suspicion of the communists and worker activism. So if you have in the Soviet sectors, you have suspicion of the capitalists and promotion of communists and social democrats through propaganda, through money, through all kinds of encouragement, you have the same sort of thing going on in the American sector. They are for democracy, but for those that promote capitalism and not those that promote socialism and worker activism. So very quickly, in many cities, when the German workers started forming councils and cells of Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party, the Americans really didn't like it and started acting against it, and then actually trying to ban it altogether. So again, democracy, yes, but not the kind that does suit your interests. And especially their promotion of a newly formed party of Christian Democrats. Basically, these Christian Democrats were technocrats, people who were not outwardly connected with the Nazi regime, but who could deliver German industry to the Americans. As a payback, they would get political power. And that is the core origin of the future West Germany. Now, in the British sector, a few words need to be said. Basically, the British were so ruined by World War II. They were so bankrupt. The Labour government wanted to pull out of Germany and just leave it alone. They were not interested. It was the last priority of British policy to worry about which way Germany is going to go. Literally, they had a plan to pull out and just forget it and concentrate on the domestic issues of socialist reform. That's what actually Attlee government did. They had huge nationalizations of industry. They had a social legislation program that made it very much a socialist country, and they were absolutely not interested in denazification well, the Nazification is okay, but deindustrialization, democratization, none of that stuff. American agenda was not British agenda under Labour government, and they were not, they basically let the Germans do what they do with a minimum interference. Now, a few words need to be said about the French sector of occupation, which always overlooked. But it was, I lived in southern Germany, I talked to people, and it was not a happy time. The French were so angry at the Germans for 2 world wars. They were so full of revenge and hatred that they actually placed African troops, colonial troops, in as occupation power. And I have heard many, many stories of rape and abuse and their theft by the African troops, black African troops from in the French zone of occupation. And the French authorities not only did not discourage it, but actually did not do anything against it. They said the Germans deserved it, and if they get a little bit of abuse, that would show them what they did to France during World War II. Now, also, the French originally had a plan, I think, of detaching Baden, which is the territory on the Rhine. They just put so many troops there that with families that it does appear that that their first objection was to saturate the population of Baden along the Rhine River next to Alsace. That it would become a part of France, maybe. But it was very suspicious policy that they just put so many families and French-speaking people in there across the river. But then very quickly, French priorities changed, and they had to withdraw all the troops they had to defend their empire, specifically in Vietnam and then in Algeria. So the French zone basically is the southern western corner of Germany. It's the Black Forest area. There was nothing happening there. Basically, the French first did this very cruel regime of occupation, and then basically let Americans do the show when they united with the other two zones and created three united zones of occupation, which in 1948 created West German state, the Federal Republic of Germany. Um, In 1948, which is really hailed as a great achievement, West German state was created and the so-called recovery plan for Europe was accepted by the United States, which is known in history as the Marshall Plan, which generated huge investment of Americans into Western Europe to regenerate normal life and production and so forth. And this is usually in all history books is advertised as great achievement of American democracy building in Europe. And it's true, $13 billion was invested and food was brought in and so forth. But what should be added to it, that this plan was very much a plan of American takeover of West European industry. If you want to be cynical, you could put it like this. It was not designed to create democracy and prosperity in Europe. It was designed to prevent Communist Party successes in Western Europe. Americans were very worried about genuine political support for communist and socialist parties in Western Europe, especially in Germany, in Italy, and in France. And here I'll give you a couple of data. The very first elections in France in 1946, these were the official results. The Parti Communiste Français, the Communist Party, 25% of the vote. The Socialist Party of France, 21% of the vote, which means that together they had 46% of the vote. And the distant third was the Popular Republican Party, Parti Républicain, 28%. In other words, in the Constituent Assembly that wrote the French Constitution, the Socialists and the Communists had a majority. And the Communist Party was going to remain a very, very important force in French politics for the next 3 decades. That is what worried Americans, and that is what worried Americans, and not democracy and prosperity. Now, same thing in Italy. Italy, which is occupied by the US troops since 1943. The first free elections, they were held in 1946. The Partito Comunista Italiano, Communist Party, 19% of the vote. The Socialist Party, 20% of the vote. So together they have 39% of the vote. And the Christian Democrats, newly formed party, just like the one in Germany, 35% of the vote. So again, the communists and socialists have a majority, but not such a great one as in France. And in Italy, you have already a formula that would last for many decades. A formula that is established. Americans would not allow Communist Party to come to power. Everybody knows this. Now, is that not a dictatorship? Is not that twisting of the arms as the Soviets were accused of? Yeah, Americans did the same thing in Italy as what the Soviet Union did in Czechoslovakia. The Soviets in Czechoslovakia twisted the arms of the socialists and forced the communist rule over the others. Well, that is what the Americans did in Italy. They made it very clear that no communist government in Italy would be allowed, and therefore the Christian Democrats became corruption, decay, and finally disappearance from the political scene in the end of the 20th century. So, how about democracy promotion comparison? Basically, one could say that both the Western powers, and that is primarily the United States because the British were not much interfering anyway. The Western powers promoted those political parties that were for capitalism and for cooperation with the United States. And the Soviet Union promoted the parties that were for socialism and for cooperation of the United States. So that picture of Soviet imposition as opposed to democracy in the West is mildly speaking distorted view. The bottom line of my comparison is like this. Politically, both sides tried to promote people that were friendly to them. The Soviet Union were more or less entitled to it because it dealt with half of those countries were at war and helped Hitler, and therefore they had to be taken under control as a result of the Soviet victory. And in terms of deindustrialization, actually, the United States did much worse to Germany than did the Soviet Union. And in the long term, for next 40 years, the Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe, but eventually you cannot force love and you cannot force to be appreciated, and this empire crumbled. But if you speak about the Western Europeans, one could make a good argument that they still are under the thumb of the United States. American bases are still in Italy and in Germany and in Turkey. 28 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, American bases fly in and fly out at will to Germany, use their bases without any consultation as to who is brought in, what kind of political prisoners are tortured there from the Middle East, and many other scandals that were revealed. In other words, the Germans are still under the thumb of Americans so many years after not only the end of World War II, but the end of the Cold War and disappearance of the Soviet Union. So that's the bottom line of the two comparisons. Thank you.